June 14, 2026. The White House lawn was turned into a live combat sports arena for an event called Freedom 250. Thousands of guests filled the space. Joe Rogan was in the ring conducting interviews. President Donald Trump sat in the audience watching. A fighter named Josh Hokett won his bout. Standing under the lights with cameras rolling and the President of the United States looking on, he delivered a line that cut through the celebration. Michelle Obama is a man. Am I right, America? It was a cruel, baseless, and transphobic claim made about a private citizen on White House grounds during an official event. This was not a random internet comment. It happened in front of the sitting president on property controlled by the White House, with national cameras present. When CNN's Jake Tapper later asked White House Communications Director Stephen Chung for a response, the entire official answer was 4 words: he had a great win last night. No condemnation, no clarification, no defense of a former First Lady, just a dismissive redirect to the fight result. Even some voices on the right pushed back. Dave Portnoy publicly condemned the remark. UFC President Dana White said he hated that kind of nonsense. For a brief moment, it looked like a basic test of decency. The White House failed that test in real time, on the record. Michelle Obama did not issue a public statement in the days that followed. She did not trend the insult or demand an apology on social media. She stayed quiet. She was waiting for a different stage. June 18, 2026. 4 days after the UFC event, the Barack Obama Presidential Center opened in Chicago. The ceremony was nationally broadcast and carefully staged. Former Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Joe Biden attended with their first ladies. Major artists performed. Cameras from across the country were locked on the stage. The atmosphere was formal, civic, and deliberately focused on legacy rather than current political combat. Michelle Obama stepped to the podium to speak about her husband's record and character. She never said Donald Trump's name, not once in the entire speech. She described Barack as unflappable at every turn. She spoke of a man who remained focused when the pressure increased, who stayed calm when others expected him to react, and who consistently looked at the long view instead of the daily cycle of outrage and response. Then she offered the observation that many people covering the event identified as the hardest-hitting moment of the afternoon. She noted how absurd it would be to even imagine that he might have buckled under pressure even once, that he might have lashed out in frustration, that he might have lost his temper in public. She did not name the current president. She did not describe any specific recent incident. She simply held up a standard of conduct and let the audience place recent events next to it. The structure of the speech did the work that direct accusations usually attempt. By refusing to say the name, she forced everyone listening to complete the comparison themselves. The room understood the contrast was immediate years of public behavior from the current occupant of the office sat quietly beside the description she was offering of her husband. No further explanation was required. Michelle Obama continued by walking through the concrete record of the Obama years. She spoke about the expansion of healthcare access, the end of a war, the operation that located and killed Osama bin Laden, the rescue of the American auto industry, and the awarding of a Nobel Peace Prize. That final item carried a particular charge in the room. Donald Trump has for years spoken openly and repeatedly about his desire to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. He has never been awarded one. The closest public moment came when a 2025 Nobel laureate handed him a physical medal as a personal gesture. The Norwegian Nobel Institute made clear at the time that the actual title and honor cannot be transferred. When Michelle Obama said the words "winning a peace prize," the reaction from the audience was instant and noticeable. The crowd responded with strong applause. Video recorded at the event shows Hillary Clinton turning toward Barack Obama and whispering something that caused him to break into a grin while the applause continued around them. The clip of that exchange spread across social media within hours. One of the most widely shared posts simply observed that Hillary Clinton appeared to especially like the Peace Prize line. Michelle never turned the speech into a direct attack. She never pointed at the current president or listed his shortcomings. She described a standard of leadership marked by calm, focus, and restraint, and she let recent events sit next to that description without further comment. The power of the moment came from the discipline of the delivery. By never naming the target, she kept the focus on the standard itself. The audience was left to do the rest of the work. Michelle Obama's public voice has a particular kind of force that few other figures in American life can match. She is not simply a former First Lady offering occasional political commentary. Over more than a decade, she has built one of the most durable and broadly trusted platforms connected to national politics. Her memoir, Becoming, became one of the best-selling books of the 21st century. Her podcast regularly attracts major guests and sustained media attention because her observations tend to travel further and land with more weight than those of ordinary political surrogates. Major polls have repeatedly placed her among the most admired women in the world year after year across a surprisingly wide portion of the political spectrum. That existing reservoir of trust is the reason a speech that never mentions Donald Trump's name can still function as pointed criticism. Audiences have learned through years of watching her that when she selects her words with this level of precision, the care is intentional. She does not need to raise her voice or point a finger. The contrast she constructs does that work on its own. In the days following the presidential center speech, she continued speaking in the same register. She described what her husband had offered the country during his time in office: a mature president, a highly intelligent president, a selfless president. The sense of hope and even joy that many people associated with those years, she said, was directly connected to the character of the man in the office. She then widened the frame, asking the country to consider not just one individual, but the kind of person it wants to see occupy that role in the future. This appearance fit a larger pattern she had already been developing. On her podcast earlier in the cycle, she had made a structural argument about double standards that became one of her most quoted statements of the period. She noted that the kind of repeated controversy and failure tolerated in the current presidency would never have been accepted if it had come from the first black family in the White House. Every standard would have been higher. Every mistake would have been magnified. The rules, she argued, were not being applied equally. She has consistently chosen careful observation over direct personal combat. That choice keeps the focus on the difference in standards rather than on a personal feud, and it allows her to deliver criticism without appearing to lower herself into the daily cycle of attack and counterattack. She never said his name. She did not need to. The fighter's remark on the White House lawn was ugly, false, and delivered in a setting that gave it official weight. The response from the White House communications director was weaker still, a four-word dismissal that treated the question of basic decency as irrelevant. Michelle Obama's speech 4 days later became the real reply. She stood on a national stage in front of cameras and described a style of leadership defined by calm under pressure, steady focus, and a refusal to lash out when provoked. She did it while the memory of the White House's official silence was still fresh in public view. The crowd in Chicago understood the subtext immediately. The clip of the Peace Prize moment and Hillary Clinton's reaction spread because the comparison required no additional explanation. Two different approaches to the presidency had been placed side by side in the span of 4 days, and the difference was visible without anyone having to draw a diagram. That is the version of the story that holds up under scrutiny. It was not a staged confrontation or a fabricated exchange. It was a real broadcast moment in which one former First Lady used the occasion of her husband's presidential center opening to hold up a standard of conduct. The events of the previous days supplied the contrast without any further assistance from her. 4 days separated the fighter's comment from the speech. The White House had answered a question about cruelty with a sports result. Michelle Obama answered with a description of character. The contrast was left sitting in plain sight, and it did not require a single use of Donald Trump's name to be understood. In the hours after Michelle Obama left the stage in Chicago, the clip of her speech began moving faster than most political moments manage in a full news cycle. It was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no raised voice, no direct accusation, and no pointing finger. Yet the quiet contrast she had drawn spread across timelines, group chats, and cable panels with unusual speed. The Peace Prize line, the description of a leader who did not buckle or lash out, and the deliberate decision never to say Donald Trump's name combined into something that felt sharper than a conventional attack. By the following morning, the White House had still issued no formal statement about the UFC comment from 4 days earlier. The four-word response, "He had a great win last night," remained the only official words on record. That silence now sat next to Michelle Obama's nationally broadcast description of calm, focus, and restraint. The two moments, only 96 hours apart, had begun to function as a single public exhibit. Inside the West Wing, the mood, according to people familiar with the discussions, was tense and reactive. The president had seen the clip. He had watched the crowd's response, and the moment Hillary Clinton leaned toward Barack Obama. What bothered him most, these people said, was not any specific policy claim in the speech. It was the fact that she had managed to criticize him at length without ever giving him the satisfaction of a direct mention. There was no name to punch back against, no quote to label fake, no personal insult to escalate. The attack had been delivered in the form of a standard, and the standard was difficult to answer without appearing to confirm it. Later that day, Trump addressed a small group of supporters at a private event in Florida. He did not mention Michelle Obama by name either. Instead, he spent several minutes criticizing people who think they're better than everyone else, and the ones who give speeches about character while the country falls apart. He returned, as he often did, to the 2015 Iran deal and to what he called the weakness of the previous administration. The audience responded with familiar applause, but the energy in the room felt thinner than usual. The Chicago speech had already occupied the day's narrative space, and his remarks sounded like a reply to something that had never directly addressed him. Cable news treated the two events as a matched set. On one side of the split screen was the fighter's comment on the White House lawn and the communications director's four-word dismissal. On the other side was Michelle Obama describing a president who remained steady under pressure. Panelists who rarely agreed on anything found themselves acknowledging the effectiveness of the approach. One conservative commentator admitted with visible discomfort that refusing to say the name had made the criticism harder to dismiss. A progressive host noted that the speech had done more damage by staying above the usual level of political combat than a direct attack would have achieved. Social media followed the same pattern. Clips of the Peace Prize moment circulated with captions that required no explanation. Side-by-side videos appeared, the UFC fighter speaking on the White House grounds, followed immediately by Michelle Obama's description of a leader who did not lose his temper. The juxtaposition needed no additional text. Users who ordinarily defended the administration found themselves arguing about the White House's non-response rather than about the substance of the Chicago speech. The silence had become the story. By the third day after the presidential center opening, the original UFC comment had been almost completely overtaken by the larger contrast. What had begun as a crude remark by a fighter was now being discussed as a test the White House had failed, followed by a response the former First Lady had delivered without ever entering the fight. The discipline of her approach continued to frustrate attempts to reframe it. There was no insult to condemn, no exaggeration to fact-check, and no personal attack to match. There was only a description of character placed next to a recent public failure of restraint. In private conversations reported by people on both sides of the political divide, a similar observation kept surfacing. Michelle Obama had not tried to defeat Trump on his preferred terrain of volume and personal combat. She had simply refused to meet him there. By doing so, she had left him reacting to a standard rather than to an opponent, and the reaction itself had begun to confirm the standard. The Chicago speech did not end the larger political conflict. It did not change the underlying policy fights or the trajectory of the administration. What it did accomplish was quieter and in some ways more durable. It created a clear public reference point, a moment when one side had answered cruelty with silence and the other had answered that silence with a description of what leadership was supposed to look like. 4 days had separated the fighter's comment from the speech. The White House had offered 4 words. Michelle Obama had offered a standard. The distance between those two responses remained visible long after the news cycle moved on. And because she had never spoken his name, the contrast continued to belong to anyone who watched the two moments side by side. In the end, the most effective reply had been the one that declined to become a reply at all. In the week that followed Michelle Obama's speech in Chicago, something unusual happened in the normal rhythm of political combat. The expected counterattack never fully formed. Donald Trump continued to appear at events and continued to speak with his usual intensity about the previous administration, about weakness, about the Iran deal, and about people who think they are superior. Yet he still avoided saying Michelle Obama's name in connection with the Chicago speech. The omission was noticeable. Advisors who ordinarily encouraged rapid personal responses found themselves dealing with a different kind of problem. There was no direct quote to label false. There was no insult to escalate. There was only a description of calm leadership placed next to the White House's own 4-word dismissal of the UFC comment. Answering it required either ignoring the contrast or appearing to argue against the value of restraint itself. Inside the administration, the discussion, according to people familiar with the conversations, kept returning to the same frustration. The speech had been effective precisely because it refused to fight on familiar ground. Every traditional response risked confirming the very point Michelle Obama had made without ever stating it. A loud personal attack would look like the loss of temper she had described as unthinkable for her husband. A dismissive joke would look small next to the scale of the presidential center ceremony. Silence, meanwhile, allowed the original contrast to keep circulating. And the contrast did keep circulating. Clips from Chicago continued to appear in new contexts. Side-by-side videos paired the fighter's remark on the White House lawn with Michelle Obama's description of a leader who did not lash out. Other edits placed the communications director's great win response directly against her comments about character and the long view. The structure of these videos required almost no narration. The two moments, separated by only 4 days, performed the argument on their own. Users who tried to defend the White House found themselves explaining the non-response rather than attacking the speech. The terrain of the discussion had shifted. Cable panels reflected the same difficulty. Hosts who usually thrived on escalation struggled to frame a clear conflict. One network attempted to turn the story into a debate about whether Michelle Obama had been political at a presidential center opening. The effort largely failed. The speech had been political in the deeper sense. It had offered a standard of conduct, but it had done so without the surface markers of partisan combat that make for easy television. Another panel spent several minutes acknowledging that the refusal to use Trump's name had made the criticism more durable. The admission itself became part of the coverage. Meanwhile, the original UFC comment began to recede from the center of the conversation. What remained was the official silence that had followed it and the speech that had answered that silence. The fighter's words were still ugly and still false, but they had become secondary to the larger question of how the White House had chosen to handle them. Michelle Obama's remarks had turned a single failed response into a reference point. People were no longer only discussing what had been said on the lawn. They were discussing what had not been said afterward and what had been said 4 days later in Chicago. In private, some Republican strategists expressed a reluctant professional respect for the approach. One described it as criticism by mirror. Another noted that it was difficult to punch at a standard without looking like you were rejecting the standard. The usual tools of rapid response, mockery, counter-accusation, claims of hypocrisy fit poorly against a speech that had never named its target and had never raised its voice. The absence of a direct opponent had become its own form of pressure. Trump's public schedule continued. He spoke about strength, about winning, about the failures of the past, yet the Chicago speech remained an unresolved presence in the broader conversation. It did not dominate every news cycle, but it also did not disappear. It sat in the background as a quiet measurement, available whenever someone needed to illustrate a difference in style or temperament. Because it had never been a conventional attack, it could not be conventionally defeated. It could only be left standing or accidentally confirmed by the manner of the response. By the end of the week, the most lasting effect was not a shift in policy or a collapse in support. It was simpler and more persistent. A clear public contrast had been established between two ways of handling pressure and criticism. One side had answered a cruel public remark with 4 words about a fight result. The other had answered that silence with a description of steady character delivered on a national stage. The distance between those two choices remained visible. Michelle Obama had not forced a confrontation. She had created a reference point. And reference points, once established, are difficult to erase. The speech in Chicago continued to do its work not through volume or repetition, but through the simple fact that it refused to become something smaller. It stayed exactly what it had been on the day it was delivered, a calm description of a standard placed next to a recent public failure to meet anything close to that standard. In the absence of a direct reply that could match its discipline, the silence around the speech began to function as its own form of confirmation. The contrast held.